Gurus, and welcome to this lecture. This lecture we're going to look at EC2 placement groups, and this is a popular exam topic, knowing what a placement group is, its use cases, and what you can and can't do with them. So what is a placement group? Well, before we actually define it, we've actually got two different types of placement groups. We've got clustered placement groups and spread placement groups. Now, the exam spread placement groups basically came out at reInvent in 2017, and when the exam talks about placement groups, they typically will be talking about clustered placement groups. So let's have a look at the difference between the two. And we'll start with a clustered placement group. So a clustered placement group is a grouping of instances within a single availability zone. And placement groups are recommended for applications that need low network latency or high network throughput or both. So basically things like Cassandra clusters or anything that you're doing with big data, you would want to have these instances inside a placement group. And this placement group means that they're within a single availability zone, and they're going to have really low latency, and they're also going to allow for very high network throughput. So let's just say you've got a cluster of servers that makes up some sort of big data cluster that you're running. You'd want to use a clustered placement group because you don't want that data to be spread across multiple availability zones. You'll want it in one central place, and you want very low network latency and very high network throughput. So when you see placement group in the exam, if it doesn't call out specifically what that placement group is, it's a clustered placement group because that is the oldest one. And then, of course, only certain instances can be launched into a clustered placement group. So you're not going to be able to launch T2 micros or T2 nanos into clustered placement groups. Typically, you'd be launching things with very high sort of RAM utilization or high CPU utilization. You can get a list of all the different instance types that are supported by clustered placement groups by going through the documentation. Don't worry, you won't need to know that in the exam. The one thing you have to remember going into the exam is a clustered placement group is always in a single availability zone. It cannot span multiple availability zones. Now, what's a spread placement group? Well, a spread placement group was launched at reInvent in 2018, and it's basically a group of instances that are each placed on distinct underlying hardware. So I want you to think of a situation where you've got these really important EC2 instances and you want to know that they're on separate pieces of hardware from each other. You would use a spread placement group. So it's recommended for applications that have a small number of critical instances that should be kept separate from each other. So basically it's the opposite of a clustered placement group. This is ensuring that it's across multiple devices in multiple availability zones. So what are the key things you should understand going into the exam? Well, a clustered placement group can't span multiple availability zones, whereas a spread placement group can. Also, if you do see the name placement groups in the exam, assume that it's a clustered placement group, simply because that is the oldest one. Spread placement groups were only released in reInvent 2017, and the exams might not yet be updated. Another thing to note that the name that you specify for a placement group must be unique within your AWS account, and that includes both clustered and spread placement groups. Only certain types of instances can be launched in a placement group, so your compute optimized, GPU, memory optimized, storage optimized, etc. AWS actually recommend homogeneous instances within a placement group. So what do we mean by that? Well, it means that the instance, both its size and the family, should be the same. You can't merge placement groups. You can't create a placement group and another placement group and then merge them together, and you can't move an existing instance into a placement group. What you can do is you can create an AMI from your existing instance and then launch a new instance from the AMI into a placement group. So that is placement groups in a nutshell. Like I said, if you see the term placement groups and it doesn't say whether it's clustered or spread, assume they're talking about a clustered placement group. If you've got any questions, please let me know. If not, feel free to move on to the next lecture. Thank you.